Hello, it's John Heaton, and today I'm going to revisit the John Lennon album Walls and Bridges, just because I'm in a bit of a Lennon mood at the moment, for obvious reasons, or if you don't know, it's because I've been listening to Mind Games a hell of a lot recently, following the reissue. And Walls and Bridges, I was looking up, I hadn't reviewed it since 2018 in Dave Costello's garden in Bristol with Dave Costello. So that's 6 years ago. And Dave has just recently moved from Bristol to Frome, so we can't do a video in Bristol anymore in that famous garden. So Frome, the famous town housing that record shop, Raves from the Graves, great record shop, where I picked up my white vinyl white album a few years ago. Anyway, Walls and Bridges. So this is my Italian copy I'm going to show you. I do own a German copy and a UK copy, and the new vinyl edition, and I think my son owns a US copy. But I'm going to show you the Italian copy in more detail because it's a bit rarer and it's in very nice condition, this, and lovely packaging from Roy Kohara, who also did the packaging for several solo Beatles albums, covers and packaging. He did, off the top of my head, he did Rock and Roll, he did Shaved Fish, and he did, I think he did Blast From Your Past from Ringo. Anyway, and he did Rock and Roll Music, which is not one of his finest efforts, the Beatles compilation. Looks more like a 50s cover than a 60s one. Anyway, this is drawings which John had made aged 11, 1952, and I'm going to be very careful, as you should be if you own this album, not to damage it, because it comes out neatly here, and then you can fold it round the back to make the amusing picture of Lennon here, or if you prefer the one without that, it's here. So yeah, my advice is don't play around with this cover too much because it's a little bit fragile, but very nice concept. And it comes with a booklet. I will show you with very nice, with more pictures and paintings from John. Here's the one from the front cover, and we've got the lyrics, of course. We've got the musician credits. Here's one of his teachers from school. I think it's Mr. Bolt, and we've got more paintings here. Quite a prolific summer of 1952 from John with all the paintings. So nice to have that, and at least one can read the lyrics here. Whereas on the Mind Games inner sleeve, they were very difficult to read because they're in very small font. So the nice thing about this Italian copy is this inner sleeve is on non-laminated cardboard, thick cardboard, and instead of the laminated UK edition I have and the others. And the Italian apple is quite interesting because it's a little bit different from the UK apple or the US apple. They're all a little bit different. So I was very happy to find that. I can't remember where I picked this up from, but and I'm going to show you quickly a German copy, which is also in very good condition. Same inner sleeve and booklet, but the German apple is obviously the familiar Gemma apple here. I've showed you a few of these. All the Walls and Bridges I've seen have been on the green apple. If any of you out there have seen a version which is on an alternative apple or alternative sleeve, let me know. I'd be interested to know that. This is my original UK pressing, picked up at the time, well, not at the time, sorry, about 1979 at a guess, when I was first getting into the Beatles, and I've kept this in pretty good condition. I'm not going to open it, but it's got all the goodies inside. And then I was disappointed by the new vinyl here. If you compare the back cover, they've really done a poor job in terms of reproducing the back cover. Look at that, in quality-wise. Noticed that quite a bit on new vinyl, particularly on Blondie Parallel Lines. I seem to remember that cover was a poor imitation of the original. And also when they brought out the red and the blue, not the recent ones, but when they first came out on vinyl a few years ago, that was a very poor imitation of the cover. I noticed the same with Beatles for Sale. So that's a kind of minor grumble. Not that I'd buy new vinyl these days. I'm trying to give up. I'm trying to give up new vinyl for sure. Maybe second-hand as well, we'll see. So this is my sheet music book. I can't remember where I picked this up, but it's got obviously the piano and guitar chords for all the songs, and then it's interspersed with lovely pictures from John at the sessions, and then John in New York, Bob Gruen picture there, and the band, famous band picture here with Kenny Asher in the foreground, Jim Keltner at the back on drums, Klaus Voormann towards the back on bass, and John on the piano. That's a very nice Walls and Bridges shot. So this is a really nice book to have. And so I've showed you all my different versions, and then, yeah, what can I say? Well, for years and years, when I first got into this album, it was the last record on which had been released from John, because he released it in 74 and then he'd released Rock and Roll in 75. Then he'd gone on a sabbatical for 5 years, as we all know, and so I got into the Beatles in 78, and Paul was active with Wings and George was sort of intermittently active, as was Ringo, but John was very silent. So naturally I sort of gravitated towards Walls and Bridges because it was the last thing we had on record from him, and I remember playing this incessantly around that sort of 79, 80 period leading up to the return of John with Double Fantasy, and just being fascinated by the packaging and the music and the sentiments behind. I'm not sure if at the time I knew too much about the sort of Lost Weekend and all the history, but I found it a very pleasing album, a very strong album, and I still do. And I know we're going to, this might provoke debates among the fans, or the fans already kind of trying to distance themselves from Mind Games, saying it wasn't a great album, and how dare you say it's a good album. Probably say the same with this album. But it's all subjective at the end of the day. I could make a case for this album, Walls and Bridges, being up there with John's best, and I could make the same case for Mind Games, particularly with the remixes. Because John Lennon, Plastic Ono Band and Imagine are always lauded as the best too, but they're not sort of perfect either. They have their slight flaws, and I think the good thing about this album is it's very, very well produced, not overproduced, and the musicianship is superb, and there's a lot of humour in the packaging and in the songs. And as May Pang points out, it was his only number one single from this album in his entire lifetime. The album also got to number one. And I love all the promotional interviews he did around the time. He sort of went around the New York radio stations and popped in as the guest and played a few records and sort of read the weather forecast and promoted his album, and also promoted Pussycats from Nielsen. So basically, when the so-called Lost Weekend started and he went to LA, he'd written the song Nobody Loves You When You're Down and Out, but he wasn't in the right state of mind to record it. He knew if he'd gone in and recorded it, it would have been a dirge. And so he put off recording it for a few months, and he sort of partied card, as we all know, with Harry and made the Pussycats album, and then went back to New York in a slightly sort of more sober state of mind, and was in the frame of mind then to lay down Walls and Bridges, and then a few weeks later the Rock and Roll album. So we've got, I'll come to the musicians in a bit. So I was thinking, Matt Williamson and I did a review of Mind Games, and he was saying during that interview, that session we did, that his favourite solo Beatle is George. That got me thinking, well, at the moment, it's John, for sure. Well, maybe that's just because I'm in a John mood at the moment, but I think album for album, with the possible exception of Sometime in New York City, we've got a pretty sort of golden nugget every time he went into the recording studio, and I include Mind Games in that, and I certainly include Walls and Bridges in that. So a few stats. Yeah, released 26th September 74 to the day, 5 years following Abbey Road. And number 1 in the US, number 6 in the UK, the album. The single, Whatever Gets You Through the Night, number 1 in the US, a disappointing 36 in the UK. I'm not sure why that was. Probably UK was too besotted with the Bay City Rollers or something, or the Wombles perhaps, which is a good thing. Number 9, Dream, number 9 in the US, and again a disappointing 23 in the UK. And even when we looked at Mind Games a month ago, the single only got to the 20s somewhere. I can't really understand it because it's an absolute classic. And by the way, I think I may have upset a few people when I said in that session with Matt that Mind Games is a better song than Live and Let Die. Well, I don't know. I think it still is. I mean, Live and Let Die is a great song for a movie, but the lyrics are completely meaningless. And so if you take the lyrics and the song as a whole, sort of as a whole package, I think Mind Games would win hands down. But I do appreciate Live and Let Die for what it is, in case you're wondering. Anyway, recorded June to August 74, Record Plant, New York City, which is where he'd recorded Mind Games as well, and actually, which is where he was on the last night of his life, remixing Walking on Thin Ice with Yoko the night he was shot. And that's interesting because he recorded the album at the Hit Factory, but that very last night he was at the Record Plant, because I think they did some of the mixing for Double Fantasy at the Record Plant. So the two studios, Hit Factory and Record Plant, not to be confused, I don't think either of them exist at the moment today, but they were very close to each other in both downtown New York City, close to Times Square, but they are different studios. And I remember listening to an interview with Julian Lennon where he thought that Walls and Bridges had been recorded in the Hit Factory. It is a bit confusing because he did record the video for Stand By Me and Slipping and Sliding in the Hit Factory, but Walls and Bridges was Record Plant, New York City. So anyway, the musicians, the familiar crew of Nicky Hopkins, who'd played on Imagine, who'd taken a time out for Mind Games, was not on that album. Jim Keltner, who'd been on Mind Games. Klaus Voormann on bass, returning. He'd not been on Mind Games. Jesse Ed Davis. I think this was the first album of Lennon's he'd played on, was it? I can't remember. I don't think he was on Imagine, and he wasn't on Mind Games. So he was on Bangladesh for George, of course, and he was on Material World for George. I don't think he'd played with John up to this point. Arthur Jenkins Jr. on percussion, and he's a sort of mystery character because I don't think I've ever seen, I think I've seen one picture of him with the Double Fantasy band, but I don't think I've ever seen him interviewed, but it would be fascinating because he played on Walls and Bridges and he played on Double Fantasy. And then we got the horn section, Ron Aprea, Frank Vicari, Bobby Keys, the famous Bobby Keys who played with the Stones, of course, and Howard Johnson and Steve Madeo. And what's interesting is Howard Johnson went on to play on Double Fantasy. So although John was on record saying he wanted new musicians for Double Fantasy, he did sort of call back a couple of people he'd worked with before. Well, he'd worked with Jack Douglas, who'd sort of engineered on Imagine. But Howard Johnson was called back, and so was Arthur Jenkins. So I'm not sure why just those two. But anyway, Roko Hara, as I said, did the packaging. Lovely ad campaigns for this album, with all kinds of promotional material, like listen to this record, listen to this badge. Even 500 New York buses were plastered with pictures of John Lennon with the caption, "Listen to this bus." So no doubt this all helped the album propel itself to the top of the charts. George Harrison, when asked when he was on his press conference for his North American tour what he thought of Walls and Bridges, described it as a lovely album. Ringo said, it's the finest album of the last 5 years from anybody, which is high praise indeed. Even Paul McCartney said, yeah, it's a great record, but I know he can do better. And then he pointed to Walrus as an example of something more adventurous or exciting that John could have done. But he did actually say he liked Walls and Bridges. So it's quite an interesting, I don't think I've ever seen that before, where a solo Beatles album is actually praised by the other three. albeit not completely praised, but good sentiments said by Paul, by all the other three Beatles. So I thought that was interesting. Now, in listening to Walls and Bridges in preparation for this review, I also listened to, from the Anthology, the Lennon Anthology, which is a superb collection of outtakes released by Yoko in 1998. This third disc of Lost Weekend contains some lovely outtakes from the Walls and Bridges sessions, some of which I prefer to the album version, like Nobody Loves You, When You're Down and Out. The version on here without the horns and the production, I think, is superior, and I think he should have left it in a stripped down state. It's just my opinion. Whatever Gets Through the Night, without the saxes and the production, without Elton's piano, very interesting to hear. I would say that the finished version is probably more poppy and more commercial, but I do appreciate this version. And we've got a couple of outtakes from Rock and Roll, of course, here. Scared, nice version as well. Stealing Glass, outtake of Surprise, Surprise, outtake of Bless You, and a very interesting version of Move Over Miss L, which turned up, it was going to be on the album, and it turned up later on the B-side of Stand By Me with a really muffled production with Lennon's voice really low in the mix and horns all over it. But here we've got just the band, and kind of funky guitar sound, and I almost wish it was on the album, because this album, if there's one thing one can say about this album, it does lack upbeat numbers. I think What You Got is about the only rocker, if you don't count Whatever Gets Through the Night. So I'm not saying it should have been on the album, because I'm not sure what to leave off, but I know my son's not a fan of Bless You, but I don't see how you could leave that off, because it's quite central to the album's theme of kind of, sort of wishing he was with Yoko. And I don't think he could have left that one off, although it's not my favourite either on the album. But anyway, so the Anthology, superb release back then. And by the way, someone mentioned that, I hadn't reviewed the bonus tracks on the Mind Games box. It's because I can't find them. I couldn't work out how to access them. And I'm the Greatest is already released on this Lennon Anthology, sort of 1998, so we're talking years and years ago. So I don't think it's anything new. Nice to have it on the Mind Games box, but as I say, I haven't figured out yet how to access it. So what else have we got to say? So I've showed you all my versions. I would rank this album pretty highly, and I know we should probably wait for the deluxe treatment next year. I did buy the Yoko early 2000s remix CD of this, and I got it posted to Hungary, and unfortunately it got broken in the post. The actual CD itself was in pieces, so I haven't got around to rebuying that particular issue, and I wouldn't mind betting it's superior to the mix that we all know here. But this is Walls and Bridges, John Lennon, a very strong artistic statement, even though he was not in the best sort of period of his life. Although he wasn't a disaster by any means, he was very sociable and mixing with all kinds of musicians and playing on people's albums. It was a very productive period. He's not the biggest fan of this album. He calls it work of a semi-sick craftsman. And he wasn't a big fan of Mind Games either. In the 1980 video interview, with all the Star Wars effects in the background, which we're hoping will be cleaned up. I think he's fond of the title track, but he doesn't think much of the rest of the album. Doesn't mean he's right, because in its remix form, Mind Games is a revelation, and this album is also a lot better than he gives it credit for. Walls and Bridges, John Lennon. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.